I wonder, this topic of realism obviously has a lot to do with authenticity in a sense as well. And if there's realisms, is there authenticities? And I guess my question goes to talking about these three phases that you mentioned, Jim. I guess in the what do you call the archival stage, I think, right? This authenticity was seen as essential, right? Collecting was only authentic stuff. Then in this next phase, authenticities or authenticness get blurred. And blurred in a sense that it's not seen as important anymore, or problematized at least. And then in this new phase, I guess maybe as museums we've moved past authenticity, but with the internet and everything that's going on around us, people seem to value authenticity a lot more, at least personal authenticity. It's become a hallmark of something, at least of branding that we've talked about as well. Brands need to be authentic to themselves, etc. So I was wondering in how far this idea of museum realisms has to do with authenticity. Maybe authenticity is coming back into our narratives, and basically what you think about this.
Thank you, Martin, for that. Opening that can of worms. It's, I mean, if I had my way, sometimes I think I would like to retire the word authenticity for maybe 20 years and see how we would do without it. I think we'd do just fine, actually, and we'd be a lot more precise about a lot of things, about what elements of value, you know, we're tagging, we're foregrounding. But that said, of course, you can't retire words like that. You have to work with them. And I guess, I mean, is this return, is my own, I'm just speaking for myself, I'm wondering about your question. Is my turn to realism in some ways a turn to authenticity, or taking authenticity seriously? And I think it is. In some ways, at the height of post-structuralist deconstruction, you know, we had in theory done away with authenticity. But then we had to deal with the fact that, for example, well, I got interested in tribal museums, and I started to learn about some of the museums that tribal people were making, and the way they were displaying their traditions and their objects seemed to me to be the most retrograde, the most backward, the most sort of unreflective, you know, only old stuff of a certain sort, all that kind of thing. And all of the plastic buckets and modern things that I wanted to bring into the Western Museum, they wouldn't have touch. So I guess I had to realize that for them, that while formally their museum looked like the old-fashioned Western museum that I was trying to open up, actually, they were coming into that space of heritage from a different history, with a different power relation to the exhibitionary complex. And so I had to really stop for a minute and try to listen to what they were trying to express with these exhibitions, with these elements in their culture that they were saving and valuing. And I guess I had to realize that authenticity is a translation term, that it's a perfectly good term like many words, but they have to be seen as, in translation, expressing people's relation usually to historicity. Everything is wearing away, everything is falling apart, everything is rotting. You know, that's true of all of us, and it's true of our lives, it's true of the world, right? So in that world, people need to save certain things, you know? They have to decide that certain things are valuable, and authenticity is a great deal about dealing with temporality and disintegration and holding on to certain things. One of the tribal museums I got interested in has a name. This is an Inuit museum. They call the museum the Weir. And the Weir is a dam built in a river to hold back some of the water for fishing purposes. But the Weir, the idea was everything's flowing down this river, we have to hold on to certain things. So, yeah, that's what museums do. And And authenticity then is something that we need to understand in very specific contexts having to do with particular communities in relation to change, in relation to threat. That's all I can think of. I mean, that's the usefulness of the word for me now. You know, it's utterly unuseful for me to decide, well, what shall we admit in the museum, what not? Well, we can have arguments about that. Yes, we should argue about that, but it shouldn't be about whether they're authentic or not. It should be, what histories are they representing? Whose voices do they reflect? Why would we want them here? Why are those stories, the stories they tell, important? That would be it. And it's not about, you know, are they somehow pure or pre-contact or all of those things. I don't know if that helps at all, but...
My privilege will say Susan will respond once and then we move to the next question.
Okay, well, because if I were you, James, I would refer to the art culture system that you drew in Predicament of Culture, where actually you show that objects move from one category to another. A same object get another meaning. So authenticity is also something that is very, very much context dependent. And what I learned in my time in the Tropenmuseum is that the inauthentic objects maybe tell a lot. Like the diorama made, home cooked in the Tropenmuseum. It tells a lot. It is an authentic object, but it is an object that comes from a museum practice. And those inauthentic objects, in a way, they are the cement in the history of the collection as such. To understand them, to understand the notion of authenticity connected to them, you have to look to the inauthentic objects as well.
I'm not sure it's a question. It's maybe more a reflection. First, I would like to thank you very much for your wonderful talk and the great responses to it. Being an art historian, I'm struck by the use, let's say, the critical use of concepts that I know so well from isms, the art historical stylistic isms, realism, impressionism, surrealism, etc., etc. And it never actually came to me that we can also use them as a, let's say, concept or concepts to unwrap certain issues in museums. But what came to my mind when I saw the plural realisms is a show that was in Paris in Pompidou in the 1990s somewhere called Les Realismes. And it was the very first time that all kinds of realisms were presented coeval to each other, very interestingly, because it was always so seen very much in a, let's say, one historical line. So that came to me as well. But what also occurs to me is that all these isms, and especially realism, is as much a construction as anything else. So for me, and of course it's kicking in an open door, but for me, then the conflation of, let's say, realism and real world or authenticity is, I think, something we should be aware of. So that's not really a question. Sorry. What do you think? I can, of course, make it into a question. What is your opinion? You may be totally disagreeing with me.
I'll do my bit. No, what I wanted to say, not only in relation to your remark, but also the earlier remark of Martin, that I think we should be very conscious of the fact that there is an enormous difference between exhibitions, only temporary exhibitions, and exhibitions that are made for 10 or 15 years. And in the field of temporary exhibitions, a museum can experiment. They can afford to make a mistake. They can push the story or the dialogue a bit further. You cannot do it in an exhibition that stands for 15 years, also because of financial reasons. You cannot redo your whole museum every 10 years. So in critically evaluating exhibitions, I think you should clearly make a distinction between permanent exhibitions or semi-permanent and temporary exhibitions.
It's actually quite in direct response to what you just said, and also some of the issues that Susan brought up in her talk, which is to say, I'm curious on your view of who is taking part in a discussion around museum budgets and strategies, in the sense that a few years ago, in 2014, I was visiting the Tropenmuseum with two friends who were artists, and they had this incredible shock to this static display of Aleppo, because it was already being destroyed. They actually went so far as to submit a proposal to make an intervention into the model, and was told that the budgets were closed and all sorts of practical considerations. They couldn't entertain any sort of input on this permanent display at this time. So after a great deal of frustration, one of the artists actually invited people to place flowers in front of the model as a kind of gesture towards the permanence of these displays. What do you think about that?
Was it flowers as in flowers on a grave? Yes. I mean, that's obviously an often heard comment on museums, right? Especially from the critical side, that they tend to bury whatever they display.
I think it was more open, though. It was also
Yeah.
to say, I mark something which is sealed and fixed with the presence of an awareness of now.
Right. Well, I think in that respect, it would be good to open up the question about the permanent displays, and especially the extent to which they are open, as Jim suggested, to a form of polyvocality, a form of interaction. I think that's the difficulty that it raises, and I think that's something we need to take on in the discussion about realism. The difficulty, obviously, that it raises is that it doesn't sit easily with one of the other missions of the museum, which is to be educational and to tell people a story that they have to learn about. And I'm never sort of completely out of that question. On the one hand, I feel the dialogic potential of the museum should be enhanced, not just in relation to so-called source communities, but very much so in relation to especially a younger audience, wherever the museum is placed. But how you then manage the problem of teaching, which obviously museums should also do, I think that's quite an interesting and open question.
Can I, you know, you should never be a moderator from inside the museum, because then you're going to feel like you're answering. But one could suggest that James also gave us an out, because we should remember that museums in and of themselves are also historical. So it means, therefore, that as part of a historical practice, there are things in a museum that will be historical. And the permanent displays, once they go on permanent displays, are almost already outmoded. So the question then is whether or not in the temporary displays or even in the educational public programs, the museum become an active participant in not realisms, but as Suzanne spoke about, in the reality of the everyday. And the question is, how do you tie those two together? The difficulty that a museum like ours always had is that they were sometimes placed outside of history rather than within history and speaking about the contemporary. I would proudly say now that our public programs are engaging with the contemporary concerns. And a museum, as Peter pointed out, it is going to be hard for you to change your permanent displays every so often. But I can proudly announce that our museum is is actually at this point trying to toy with the idea of having shorter and smaller permanent displays to shift the temporalities a little bit. We had a conference on temporalities recently. Any other question? We're kind of wrapping up now.
I was struck by the comment that James Clifford made about how the bush of magical realism, rather than the arrow, creates a truer experience, a truer, what was it? It's truer to lived experience. And I just wanted you to reflect a bit on what sorts of truths, because this is a lecture on realism, sort of what sorts of languages. When you said that, I was reminded of the Borges Exactitude of Science story, and I was just thinking about sort of what sorts of languages of truth and that we have to draw on if we're trying to think about the truth of a lived experience.
I'm not too good with truth, but I am comfortable with realism, and so that tells you something. That's just maybe my post-structural predicament. But I mean, realism is realism suggests suggests a representation or a enactment in some way of something that's, yeah, really there. But it's not, but it's a construction. It's always a construction, and it's self-evidently a construction. It's a partial truth. I use that phrase back in the day of writing culture. I got in trouble. They say, why do you even say truth in your partial truth? You know, you're copping out. You're losing your radicalism by doing that. But no, partial truth that's realism. It's always perspectival. It's always from a perspective, but it's a serious attempt to render something that actually exists in a complicated way. And the reason I feel kind of comfortable bringing it into the Ethnological Museum is I think that people expect, it's the tradition of the Ethnological Museum, to tell true things, you know, about the world. Art museums, no, it can be enough to exhibit famous artists or have beautiful things or subversive things, you know. You're not, the call to representation is less, I think, in the art world than it is in here, in the Ethnological Museum. And that's partly that scientific, the ethnology or anthropology part of the museum, which is a heritage that I don't want to see disappear entirely. I think it has to be brought forward in kind of new ways, maybe more flexible and more open ways than the older scientific taxonomies and regimes of representation allowed. But that commitment to saying something about reality outside of my own head and outside of our cultural worlds, or the world of your class or your gender or your whatever positionality is involved, while recognizing that this is not the whole story, but it's a big enough story about the world that you're telling. That's realism, and I really feel attached to that project. You know, I don't want to leave realism to the natural scientists, who then reduce it to empiricism, and then it can get down to, if you can't count it, it doesn't count. You know, kind of reductionisms on the one hand, or I don't want to leave it to the philosophers, who are they're too worried about nailing down what exactly is the fact of the matter, and in the process they leave out all the really important and interesting messy things, like genders and cultures and those kind of things, the kind of things that I'm interested in. So we need something messier and something more perspectival inherently, but serious, you know, in a way. And that's what realism keeps me in the seriousness game, I guess. And that to me is worth it. But I really don't want it to be a conservative mode, you know, going back to the old realism that we always knew before all of this critique happened now. And I'll say in my defense, in that book, Writing Culture, which was published, what, in 1986 or something, I wrote the preface to it. And at the end, I was, in a sort of defensive way, I was saying, well, because we were questioning representation at every level. And at the end, I said, well, people are going to react to this. They're going to say, invoking Plato, I think I said, poets will once again be banned from the city. You know, there will be a reaction to all of this, I said. And there'll be talk of a return to realism, I said. But then I said, But to return to realism, you must first have left it, okay? And I think I've earned it. I think I actually did. I can come back to realism because I really did leave it, you know? It's not about some back to basics, you know. Okay, you had your fun with all that epistemological jitters and political correctness, you know. Now let's get back to telling it like it is. No, it's not about that. But it's something more dialectical and something more contingent, but nonetheless serious attempt to think outside of your constraining culture, your constraining identity, or you know who you think you are. That's what ethnology museums can do better. I say it better than any other museum. They're positioned to do that, and why can't we get that across to people? How important it is in an interconnected world of the sort we have. I mean, it just seems obvious to me, and yet they say, oh, it's about the little people, you know, it's not, you know, people don't get it. And I say, well, I think there's a job to do here, and realism is not the right category. I mean, no, you're not going to go around, I think, inscribing this on our banners. But it is, for me, a way of beginning to think in this way about the kind of stories and the kind of truths, plural, you know, we are able to tell in these museums. And so that's my little profession of faith.
And that, actually, with such a hopeful note on the role of the Ethnographic Museum, I think that there's nothing else to say but ask to close. Thanks, James. Thanks to all of the speakers, Peter, and Suzanne, for a wonderful conversation. This forms part of our ongoing conversation, not to navel gaze at the Ethnographic Museum and think about its futures, but actually to be participant in structuring a museum of the present and the future that uses the wealth of its collection to engage with what is happening in a complex world in which we live. And that's what we hope to do with the Research Center. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I must say thanks to Carrie Nakamura, who is sitting there, from Light and Global Interactions, because we jointly did this event, and I haven't said anything about that. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.